Now that we learned so much about observables, we're almost done with that section and ready to continue, but there is one other important construct that you should not miss, and that is the subject. Now, what's the subject? Well, let's say in our user component here, we have a button, which I'll add, and I'll give it a class of button primary, and I'll give it a label of activate. Now, the idea is that when we click this button, we change something in the app component, so in a different component, and we simply print activated here, let's say. So we add another horizontal line, and in between, we want to print activated, but we want to only show this if we clicked activated on the user component. Now, how can we make this work? Well, with a service and an event emitter, for example. That is something you also learned about earlier. So let's quickly do that. Let's add a new file here, the user service.typescript file here next to the app component. And in there, I'll export a class, user service. Nothing too special. It will get the add injectable decorator, which is imported from @Angular core. And I will use the more modern syntax for providing it. I'll add provided in root here. Alternatively, you simply add it to providers in the app module here, which is also fine. But this is a shortcut, a shorter and easier way. Now we have that service. And in there, I'll add a property, activated emitter, which is a new event emitter. And event emitter is also imported from @Angular core. That's a pattern I showed you earlier already. And that event emitter will emit a Boolean. We can now use that event emitter from inside our user component if we inject that service here. So the user service is injected here. For that, of course, make sure to also import it from that user service file. And now we just need to add a new method on activate. And in there, I'll call my user service, reach out to activated emitter, and call emit, and pass true here as a value. And now the last step is to wire up on activate here in the user component to the button by adding a click listener to the button, and there I will call on activate. Thus far, nothing too fancy. That is a normal way of passing the data around, or at least of emitting an event across components. Now we want to listen to that event from inside the app component, and for that we simply inject the user service here too by using that injection shortcut also, where we automatically bind it to a private property named user service. And I'll then add a new property here too, user activated, which is false initially, and in ng on init we can set up a listener. We can reach out to the user service, activated emitter, and subscribe to it. And in there, we get our did activate, or whatever you want to call it, Boolean, and we'll set this user activated equal to did activate. And therefore, whenever we emit true as a value here, user activated will switch to true. And in the app component HTML file, that now means that we can use ngIf here to conditionally show that paragraph as soon as user activated is true. Let's save all of that. Let's navigate to that user page here, and let's click activate. And indeed, we see activated here. So this is working, which of course is nice. This is the old approach with the event emitter. And this is an approach you could use, but there is a better one, a more recommended one. And that new approach, the better approach, uses a subject. Now, a subject is something we import from RxJS. So you import subject from RxJS. Instead of event emitter, you now create a subject here. Other than that, it's pretty similar though. It's a generic type where you define which data will eventually be emitted. In this case, a Boolean. So it's very similar to event emitter thus far. We also use it very similarly. In the user component, we don't call emit, however, but something you saw before already, you call next. Because a subject is a special kind of observable, you could say. We know observables, we can subscribe to them as you learned, but they're rather passive. You learned how to create your own observable, but the core idea always is that you wrap a callback or an event or something like that. A subject is different. A subject also is an object you can subscribe to, but it's more active because you can actively call next on it from outside. Remember, in the observable, we also called next, but that was from inside the observable when we created it. So that is a more active observable that is perfect when we want to use it as an event emitter. So if we don't have a passive event source, like an HTTP request or DOM events, but if we have something that actively needs to be triggered by us in our application. And that's exactly the use case we have here. We now can call next here in the user service on our activated emitter. The activated emitter is that subject. And in the app component, we still call subscribe because it is an observable and therefore we can subscribe. If you now save that, you click activate again, it still works, but now it's a subject. And whilst it technically, of course, works in a similar way, using a subject is the recommended way. Don't use event emitter, use subjects. They are in the end a bit more efficient behind the scenes. You can also now use all these cool operators because a subject in the end also is kind of an observable. So you have that too, which is a huge advantage, and it's simply something you can and should keep in mind. Use subjects instead of observables. One important note, just as with your own observables, you should unsubscribe to your subjects though whenever you don't need them. So add on destroy here to the app component, which you need to import, or to any other component where you set up a subscription to your subject. Store the subscription, activated sub is a subscription. Subscription needs to be imported from RxJS, so make sure to add that import in your file as well. Store that subscription then, so here where you call subscribe, you simply set this equal to activated sub so that the subscription is stored here. And then you add ng on destroy, and inside of ng on destroy, you simply use your subscription and call unsubscribe. And now you have a great application without any memory leaks or anything like that. Now, one important note about subjects as a replacement for event emitters, this only counts if you're using them as cross-component event emitters, where you manually call next or previously emit. You don't use subjects instead of event emitter when you're using at output. So if you're using in a component, if you're using at output here, with your own event, you still use the Angular event emitter. You're not using subject there because the subject is not suitable for that. There you need the Angular event emitter. You only use subjects to communicate across components through services, so through a mechanism where you in the end subscribe to somewhere, like here in the app component. If you're not subscribing to an event emitter, then it probably is an output. If you do plan to subscribe manually, then it is a subject. That's it for observables. You saw how you can build your own observable to basically get an idea of what's happening behind the scenes, how you can subscribe to it and provide different functions to do different things for data, errors, or the observable being completed. You learned about operators, which you add by using the pipe method on the observable, and then by adding the operators you import from RxJS operators, which are tools that might not look super useful right now, but which will actually become quite handy throughout the course, since they make it easy for us to build nice code structures where we have a clear chain of steps we want to execute on the data we're getting, let's say, from a server, and therefore they're really powerful. And you learned about subjects, which are in the end a better event emitter, you could say. And with that, you have a thorough foundation about observables. Now also check out the advanced resources you find in the last lecture of this module, and which I also already showed you throughout this module if you want to dive way deeper. But with that, we now have all the preparation to continue with the course.